So that was one of the first things I could see, is the level and insistence of coupling of economic growth with energy and carbon emissions. And this is not something that's not yet published, but one of the things I did is I tried to see how much can carbon emissions or energy account for growth internationally. Like, if you try to explain all economic growth through the growth in energy or through the growth in carbon emissions, it's huge. It's on the order of 80%. Or for primary energy and economic growth, I think it's even higher. So economic growth is really fossil fueled. That's one of the things. However, one of the things that's not fossil fueled, and that was something that just sort of fell out of the data once you cared to look, anybody could have looked and found this, is that well-being or social function or the things that allow us to live good and decent lives are not highly coupled to energy or to fossil fuels. And that's good news, right? So you see two things. When you're looking at the good life, and I'm going to define it very simply. I'm going to define it as physical health and mental health and the ability to function well in society. And to function well in society, you need to be able to do exactly what you guys are doing here, which is criticize and change society. So it's basically around good social function. So if you look for this, if you look, for instance, for physical health, measured by life expectancy, you see something very simple. You see saturation. The energy required to have good physical health saturates. At the beginning, if you have very low energy use, you need to use a bit more. But then eventually you reach a level where more energy use does not lead to better outcomes. And that's really interesting, right? Now, the other thing that's really interesting is that that level at which of energy at which your health outcomes don't change has been going down and down and down over time. We're actually seeing huge levels of efficiency in the amount of energy that's required to live a decent life. And isn't that good news? So that's an incredibly positive thing, and it's the same for education, and it's the same for pretty much any well-being indicator you choose to look at. So the amount of energy we need to live healthy, long, decent lives with good levels of education is not infinite, and it tends to go down over time, rather fast. However, economic growth is still happening and is still requiring lots of energy. So what's the disconnect? Why is the economy growing when we don't need it to grow for it to have a good life, and we don't need energy use to grow to have a good life? And this is where we basically come into the political aspect of it, which is one of the things I'm studying now, which is what are the politics of production and the politics of consumption. So if you have all this energy extraction, all this energy use, who is it serving? Who is being served by economic growth? Some people in society are being served by it. A very, very small minority, but a very powerful one. And that's basically the answer, is that the reason that we have economic growth with ever-increasing energy demand is not because it's going to lead to better lives for all of us. The contrary is completely obvious to anybody at this point. It's because the people in power see it as the only way to maintain their power. If you want me to use academic jargon, growth is a stabilization mechanism of capitalism. Capitalism requires growth in order to keep the machine going. And that's the trap that we're in. So one of the things that I'm doing now in terms of my research is we're looking at that for car dependency. So we've sort of tried to flip things around. We're not looking at cars as a product. The product is not cars. The product is not being able to live without a car. That's what they're really trying to get. That's what our current industrial society is really aiming at. And it's happening in all kinds of ways, and you can see the historical development of it. And I think it's really fascinating. I've learned a huge amount about how much the automotive industry has political power, how much they have economic power, how much they require growth to survive. They are an industry that cannot deal with anybody not buying a new car. If people stop buying new cars, which happens in a recession, they basically go completely mental, ring all the alarm bells, and have all kinds of incentives in place to ensure that they still have growing markets. Because their production imperatives, the size of their factories, the way they produce, the way they spend money, does not allow them to reduce production. So everybody is allowed to fail, but they can't, if they stop growing, they collapse. And that's one of the, so we're seeing really interesting things come out in terms of why do we have production? Why do we have consumption? Who is it serving? Well, the punchline is it's serving the producers and nobody else. So I don't want to, I'm sorry? It's okay. I wanted to say a couple of words about this because I was just at a conference where the industry was taking, there was people there from industry, and they were taking the kinds of results that myself and my colleagues have produced and turning it sort of against us and against the kinds of conclusions that we have. And they were doing it in a very insidious way. So one of the things that the people in ecological economics have been doing is they've been doing, for instance, trade-adjusted accounting. They've been doing accounting for carbon emissions in many different ways. You account for it through the emitters, through the producers, through the manufacturers, through the consumers. And so consumption-based carbon accounting is a really big deal. It tells you a lot of information. What it does not tell you is that the consumer is the one responsible for all these emissions. Yes, the dollars spent have a supply chain that then implies those those emissions happening, but the consumer doesn't have a heck of a lot of choice and agency at the end of it all. At the end of it, you need to eat, you need to work, you need to do this, you need to do that. You're not going to have a huge amount of choice about the way your supply chain is structured. But the industry people were using this consumption-based carbon accounting to say, oh, well, anyway, 70 to 80% of emissions can be directly allocated to consumers. Consumers are responsible for the emissions. And I've seen this done by the food industry, and I've seen it done by the fossil fuel industry. Not coincidentally, two very high emitting sectors, where they're basically saying, oh, it's not on us. Consumers are responsible for this. And I just wanted you guys to be aware of that because I think it's a very insidious argument that is not in fact borne out by the research. The research says, yes, you can allocate it to consumers, but they are not responsible in a sense of having choices about it. Okay, so I don't want to just talk a heck of a lot longer.
We want you to carry on.
Well, I'm happy for questions if necessary, but
I don't know what to ask. I'm learning something new every minute.
Yeah, just carry on.
okay.
It's like,
Do you want water?
it's not.
Okay.
It's the bad tools that we're given, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not like we're choosing the toolbox. When people say, "How did you get here?" Well, I got here by the only tools available to me. But if there was a kit that was non-harming, we'd be all choosing that, wouldn't we?
So, well, maybe I can say a few more words about the role of. Sorry, it's on this page. So I'll get this one. The role of research and communication, and that's something I've just been completely obsessed by because it's sort of like it's kind of on us at this point. Basically, the research community of natural scientists and other people who knew about climate change, they've known about this now for so long, and they've been ringing alarm bells for so long, and been so ineffective for so long, that we really kind of have to have a reckoning of why the heck have we not been listened to? And I've got lots of theories about this. I can talk about it for even longer. But I think, again, it comes down to who has power. Just because we know that big changes are needed, and we give that evidence to decision makers, and we publish it in journals, and we try to raise awareness about it, doesn't mean that anybody is going to listen to us or is going to change anything. Now, it used to be that scientists, we saw ourselves as kind of we're useful. People listen to us because we're useful. We bring information that is helpful to the economy, to society. And I think we still do. We definitely still do. But one of the things we've done is we've basically turned around and bitten the hand that feeds us, right? We're now basically saying, we're now going back on our society and the system that allows us to have universities and nice jobs and saying, you guys need to change, right? Massively so. And that gets us into all kinds of trouble. And we're not being listened to because it turns out that having the best information and research is not the same at all as having power or the means to change things.
Yeah.
And I just want to talk a bit, so we're trying to have to think about what power do we have. I think we have the power to be advocates as well as scientists. I would not shy away from that at all. I think anybody anybody who tries to be a scientist without being an advocate, given what we know now about climate change and the various tipping points and planetary boundaries that we're crossing, anybody who knows that and is not an advocate for change is basically not a responsible human being. So that's quite an easy one. But I think that we also have to think about how we're communicating and how we're participating. And one of the ways that I think that climate change is not well communicated, and Alan was just raising this, is, for instance, we hear, oh, it's hot. Nice weather. People, you know, Britain is gonna run out of sunscreen or whatever. And nobody's making the link to climate change. And if they do make the link to climate change, it's just like, oh yeah, it's climate change. And that's like a sentence at the end of the article. And this is happening over and over. So I'm probably gonna get this animal's name wrong. Does anybody remember a story a couple of years ago or 6 months ago about the saigas of Kazakhstan? They're a kind of antelope. Oh, you do remember. So they're an animal in Kazakhstan where there were hundreds of thousands of them, and over the course of 3 days, 60% of them fell down dead. They're cut over areas of hundreds of miles. And they had this whole detective work of trying to figure out what this animal that was no longer on the endangered species list, how overnight, basically, they lost more than half of their population. And it has to do with bacteria at the back of their throats, strep bacteria, that were activated because of unusually long spells of warm temperature. So they died of strep blood poisoning, is what it came down to. And it was climate change, right? So you have this thing, the saigas dying off in Kazakhstan, just littering the landscape over hundreds of miles with just animals who fell down dead where they were. And it's climate change, and it's this huge apocalyptic story, and then it's gone. It's there for one day, and you never hear about it again. How about the puffins going extinct off the Shetland Islands? Do you remember that story?
Yeah.
That's closer to home. Again, it's climate change. And again, it's a one-day wonder, a one-day disaster. And nobody pays attention to it afterwards. And the dots aren't connected. So the media is doing an absolutely terrible job at connecting the dots of all these things around us that are happening to climate change. Not in the future. You know, it's happening right now. The Antarctic ice thinning, record temperatures all over the world. So we're having all these events, and not only is the media not communicating it in such a way that we can educate ourselves and connect the dots and become really aware of the larger patterns that surround us, but they're also not giving us tools for agency. They're also not telling us what we can and need to and should do. And they're not calling our politicians and our leaders and our opinion makers and our pundits and whoever is on the Great British Bake Off, if that's even happening, or the World Cup, or they're not going to people who are in the news visibly and calling them to account on it. So we're not having these bigger discussions about what the heck we're doing about these stories that are happening all around us and affecting us right now. And I think that scientists fall into this trap too, of just sort of presenting climate change as this thing that's inevitable. Oh, it's going to warm. Well, you better get ready for it. Yeah, no, we need to do something. We need to do far more than just get ready. So I think that one of the things we need to do is, when we're thinking about climate change and what's happening here in terms of extraction that shouldn't be happening, what's happening all over different countries around the world, is we need to be thinking about connecting the dots, and we also need to be thinking about agency. We need to be thinking about what responsibility and actions we can all take at different levels, and always banging on that drum. And you guys here are obviously the activists, so I'm not going to preach to the choir in terms of about, you know, you're the people who are already doing as much as possible, as much as you possibly can, including direct action, including going to court, including putting your bodies on the line for this, and that's absolutely important. But I think that in general, everybody has a possibility of action. And it's not even rocket science. At this point, it's very simple. Don't eat animal products, stop driving cars, stop flying, live in smaller houses, and don't consume as much, right? That's going to like already do a huge amount just from a personal level. And at a community level, you can talk about it, you can educate people. At a political level, you can call your elected officials to account. So I'm ashamed that my own MP voted for the expansion of Heathrow, and that just tells me I've wasted my time. I should have been calling him, I should have been going to his office. He's not a bad guy. He thought the Paris Agreement was a good idea. but then he goes around and turns around and votes for the Heathrow expansion. And MPs all over Manchester voted for Heathrow expansion. We can't get our own rail electrified in Manchester. And they're voting for money to go to London to emit more greenhouse gases. I mean, it's just insane. So there's so much we can do in terms of communicating to our elected officials. And then also in terms of our workplaces. Everything we can do in a better way for the challenges that surround us. And I guess that's the only positive thing, and I think that's the only thing that's keeping me sane, especially because I'm part American. So it's really been a great couple of weeks from that perspective. So apologies for that. Oh yeah, and I assume there's going to be an anti-Trump protest here. You know, everybody should go to those next week. So actually this week, Friday. Cheers. Yep. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely just the kind of things that we needed to hear today, here, during this extended heat wave that is global. It's not just in the UK. But don't tune into the BBC, don't tune into ITV, and unfortunately, don't even bother to look at Channel 4 News because they are not joining the dots. There are just two things that I want to say, one of which I'd forgotten at the beginning, and the other one was I wasn't allowed to say anything about it until now. I had to wait till after 12:30 was gone. And Julia said in her talk that one of the things we need to do is to fight all of these issues on several different fronts, and she particularly talked about our elected representatives. Well, I can tell you now, because it is now, or will be made public now, that Saturday a small group, myself for the Green Party, somebody for Labour and somebody for the Lib Dems, we met with Copeland's Conservative MP, who was elected last year, who initially had refused to sign the Divest Parliament pledge. Well, we saw her Saturday, and after a whole load of emails, letters, tweets and stuff in the newspapers and so on, it only took us 15 minutes on Saturday to persuade her to sign. Wow. And that, those of you that don't know about the Divest Parliament pledge, it is actually calling on MPs to call on their pension fund managers to divest from fossil fuel companies and to put the money into renewables. And here's a little piece of information for Francis Egan, if should he be listening. One of the companies that the MP's pension fund is heavily invested in is Centrica. So you might find that your money tap eventually gets turned off. And I think one of the things that concerned our MP was the fact that as we get into a situation where we clearly need less and less fossil fuel, those investments in fossil fuel companies, especially if we make their life hard, is actually not going to pay them a very good pension at all. The other thing which I forgot to say is that just yesterday, Sian Berry confirmed that she will be here on the 30th of July, because she had wondered whether maybe she might come on the 23rd, but she will be here on the 30th. Those of you that are Green Party members, she will be doing a kind of a hustings at the community hub once she has done her talk. So those of you that do have a vote in these elections coming up for the Green Party, if you want to ask any questions about her policy, her aims, etc., then there's an opportunity for you. Okay, thank you very much.